Okay, now I'm going to turn us over to Dr. David Fawcett.
Thank you, Scott, and welcome everybody. Good evening. As Scott mentioned, I usually talk for a couple minutes, 10 minutes or so, about some kind of topic that's related to recovery and addiction. And tonight is one that we've talked about before, but I think it's always worth revisiting, and that is just how do we manage the idea of change and embracing change as we move into recovery, and what that all means, because addicts typically are very resistant to change. We, speaking as addict myself, we like to avoid conflict. We like to avoid change. We like to avoid commitment. So change is something that certainly in my life was kind of abhorrent. So even though I hated where I was at when I was in my addiction, I was uncomfortable, I was miserable, but I was also afraid that recovery might be worse somehow. And mostly it was unknown. I just didn't know. So when we think about change overall, our life has changed, really. Everything, there's a lot of adages about the only predictable thing in life is that there is a lot of change, and I guess taxes too. But recovery is really the antithesis of everything we are geared up to do as addicts. We're geared up to close up, we have defenses, we're in denial, we tell ourselves stories about things, we make things work and fit, and we kind of gloss over the inconsistencies, the things that aren't working so well, we minimize those. And so we really, our life is kind of constructed around avoiding change. And so when we get into recovery, when we take that moment of surrender and we're willing to admit that we're powerless over this thing, whatever it is, whatever kind of addictive disorders we may have, we're really starting to really stare change in the face. And that becomes problematic for a lot of people. And we don't really know how to do that, because it involves giving up control. It involves surrendering. It involves admitting powerlessness. And these are all things that are really kind of difficult for us to do. So I think that's really one of those things where we don't arrive at that ability to change, excuse me, until things are so bad that we have to. And I think that's hitting bottom for most of us, where it outweighs the attempt to keep things going and patch together. So really, I think everybody avoids change, but I think addicts perhaps most of all. So change is inevitable. Change really goes to the territory, and it's true that if we don't change, we don't move into recovery, and we probably aren't going to make it, even sometimes survival. So how do we handle these changes? The first, I think, is to evaluate whatever level of control we have over a particular situation. And by that, I mean really employ that marvelous thing that we call the Serenity Prayer. You know, the Serenity Prayer very concisely kind of summarizes to evaluate situations or things or problems, so that it says basically, what can I change about this? What do I need to accept about this? And it kind of helps us has some wisdom to know that difference, right? And so really that's an important and critical skill to evaluate, okay, what is that I can change about my life? And we can apply this toward even recovery steps, many recovery steps. So I remember when I first got into recovery, like most addicts, I think my life was full of kind of chaos and crises, and things were not going well at all in practically every sphere of my life. And it was really messed up. And so I had to kind of see, okay, what can I manage today? You know, what are problems that are going to need attention, but this I can't really manage today? So I put stuff up on the shelf for a while. And my strategy in early recovery is that when they fall off the shelf, I guess it's time to deal with them, because I have my hands full just staying sober. And so really, what do I have to control? I can control my going to meetings. I can control reaching out. I can control lots of things in my day, even though my whole life felt sort of out of control. So I think really picking and choosing where we actually have some ability to accept things or control things or change things as best we can is really critical. And there were some things that I determined that I couldn't change. I just had to accept. And there were certain situations, there were certain, just whether it was physical or financial or relational, all those things that I just had to kind of accept. So I think that's really at first, and I think when we first are confronted with these things, it seems overwhelming. I think at least I and people, my clients I've worked with over the years, get a sense of really being flooded by all the change and the potential and the messes in our lives and just all the stuff that's ahead of us, these great seeming challenges, and that we have no control over this kind of huge wave rolling forward. And I'd really encourage people to sort of take the things that we have, but we have some power to choose and affect. And really that's us. And we may not have any control over our partners or our jobs or anything else, but we can control what we do and what we don't do. And that's oftentimes reminding ourselves on a daily basis that we need to surrender to this. So that serenity prayer is helpful, as I mentioned. And maybe just self-care. Okay, what do I have control over today? I have control over eating a healthy breakfast or getting to bed at a normal time or making outreach calls. Or those are the things that I may have control over. And those directly impact my recovery. So I think it's really, really important. And we know, of course, now, not just making calls and doing that outreach, but really connecting in a profound way, that those connections are really critical. And that's one thing I really focused on in early recovery, was building those connections, because in my addiction, I was basically alone. I'd burned bridges. I didn't have those people. And so it was essential to learn how to do that in recovery. I mentioned the self-care. I just want to focus on that too, because that's another area we have some control over, and it can help us really start to face the change. So physical self-care, many of us are run down, many of us are not adequately nourished and hydrated, and we don't have enough sleep, and we're not, certainly I think our spiritual lives are kind of a mess when we get into early recovery. So all these areas are critical areas to kind of restore ourselves. And I think a lot of us feel so bad about who we are, and there's such shame that even self-care is sometimes hard to kind of rally around. That's even deserving to eat a good meal, or deserving to take care of ourselves. It feels sometimes needy and kind of overindulgent. But I think really helping that, really managing those feelings. And I think one of the first feelings that we often don't talk about, that I think is a really important task of recovery, is grief. And there's a grieving task that I think is essential early in recovery, along with feeling all the other feelings. But we have to grieve what we're giving up, and for all its pain. We're giving up our coping mechanism. We're giving up our ways of not feeling. We're giving up our ways of avoiding stuff. And we're giving up maybe the only pleasure we think we're getting in our lives. So there's a lot of loss. And in addition to just all the loss of the addiction, we may have lost relationships or lots of money or our health. But I think it's important not to push away that grief, because that really is an important step, because there's a lot of loss that's gone on with addiction. I think that unless we actually feel that and let go of some of the things, including, by the way, the fantasies about the sex that we might have in porn or on methamphetamine, or all that kind of super stimulated false kind of fantasy sex, it's not sustainable and really not realistic either in the long run. So I think there's a lot of things to really let go of, and that really we have to acknowledge that loss and pay attention to what's going on besides it. And by the way, that may take some professional help. I think there are many moments in which in recovery, the help of a therapist is really beneficial. And people can do it without a therapist, but I think it just saves enormous amounts of time. Like coming to treatment. I think coming to treatment, even a 2-week intensive, really can save people a year or two of kind of floundering around trying to find their own way. And so those kind of self-care steps are really important. Another thing to do, really monitor our thought patterns. I've said a couple of times recently that one of my first sponsors once said the space between my ears is a very dangerous neighborhood. And it's true. If I get up in my thoughts, still, I'm kind of cautious about that without some balance. It's a very distorted place. It's a place where rationalizations flow very easily and effortlessly. It's a place where I can minimize things that I don't really want to look at, or maximize things that I want to point to and say, see, I'm really okay. All that stuff gets kind of this weird funhouse kind of distorted mirror kind of life that we have to really start to sort out in early recovery to really embrace this change. So monitor thought patterns. There's something we call cognitive distortions that I think are really useful for people to know about. Things like black and white thinking. So I might tell myself, it's a choice between doing this or that. And in my addict's mind, I ignore all the 1,000 choices, the gray area in the middle, that where probably the more realistic choices lie. But it's not these false choices that I give myself. I usually end up painting myself into a corner. Other cognitive distortions are jumping to conclusions like, okay, well, that person looked at me cross-eyed here in this meeting, so no AA meeting, no CMA meeting is ever going to work for me again. That kind of thing. Just not giving things time to settle in, finding fault, and then making it a reason why we can't do that. What I hear about this often is the God talk, right, in program. And people, skip over the fact that it's a God of our understanding. Nobody's prescribing somebody with a white beard and this white guy commanding us to do things. That's not what program is saying. The big one I find people doing early on is catastrophizing. It's like, oh my God, this is awful. This is never going to be the same. It's a disaster. And not that we don't have, problematic situations, but I think this is a mindset that we bring to every situation. We spill our cup of coffee. Oh my God, it's a disaster. So we have no kind of way to kind of scale those things. So be aware of your thoughts and really be very pure about your thoughts, because they can really get us in trouble. Be realistic. Sometimes we tell ourselves things, we tell ourselves stories that we've always told ourselves. So I think reality testing is a really important thing. We've talked about how important connections are, but we really need to talk to people and say, well, this is what I'm thinking of doing, or this is why I think I can't do that, or this is the situation I find myself in, and I think I only have this choice. Let's do some reality testing. And I found, even with a lot of years on belt with recovery, I still rely on people to help me get some objective feelings about stuff. I still don't quite trust only my viewpoint. I have a lot more confidence in it, but I really, as a matter of course, seek out the opinion of other recovery people that can help me see stuff. And then think about resilience. And I do a whole lecture for our clients on resilience, but I've often said resilience is not a character trait we're born with. Resilience is a skill. Resilience is like a muscle. We go to the gym and build up other muscles. We can practice and build up resilience. And resilience gives us this ability to kind of ride through emotional discomfort, to go through darker situations, and to get help, and to ask for help, and to know that we're worthy of it. And mostly that we can't do it by ourselves. And so I think really emphasize resilience. And one thing as a therapist I often try to do is ask clients, where are some situations where you've been successful? And they might be able to name a situation occupationally or in some other area, they're like sports or something. And we can take those skills for success in those areas and transfer them to recovery. So I think just because sometimes people have this really distorted view of themselves where I can never make this. It's just beyond me. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to be able to do it. But they succeed in other areas of their lives. So we take those skills and transfer them to the recovery. Maybe they have more skill sets that are going to help keep them clean and sober than they thought they were. And a couple more, staying in the present. I think we have to we're so quick to jump into the future, usually with anxiety, or jump into the past, usually with regret and sadness, and just drag us right out of the present tense. And I'd really encourage you to do everything to stay right here and now, because it's really the only thing we have. And finally, just to clarify priorities. I remember in recovery, I was so upside down and spun around. I had no idea which way was up. And so I really, when times got rough, those rough patches that everybody gets in recovery, it was really helpful to kind of figure out, okay, where do I want to be in a year? Where do I want to be in 5 years? What am I doing this for? Because it's so easy to get caught up in the day-to-day crises that we kind of forget where we're going. And so don't forget that, and have some targets, have some goals, have some reasons why you're doing this. And I think with that, I'll stop. Thanks.
Thank you, David. Everybody type some questions into the Q&A feature and we will answer them. We've got one in there, but I've got a couple questions for David before we get rolling with those. But type them in there. We got a smallish group. We should be able to get to everything today. When I first got into recovery, somebody looked at me and said, "If nothing changes, nothing changes." And I was kind of dumbfounded by that. And I was like, "What do you mean?" And they're like, "Well, actually, you only have to change 3 things." And then they said people, places, and things. I was like, well, that's everything. And recovery really is this massive life change that we do resist. I mean, until I was willing to change, nothing changed. My life kept stumbling along. Maybe I was drinking a little less or having periods of sobriety or acting out a little less often and having periods of sobriety in this addiction, but nothing was getting any better. As a matter of fact, my life was slowly getting worse and at times quickly getting worse because I wasn't making any changes. And you mentioned therapy, and you mentioned treatment. I always think about the 12 steps. I think the 12 steps are designed to walk us through the changes we need. I was wondering actually if you would comment a little bit about the 12 steps and their role in the
Yeah.
process, along with treatment and along with 12 steps, along with everything else we do.
Yeah, totally. The 12 steps, um, kind of in their wisdom, really provide a guide that not just only kind of sets a pathway for us, but it sets kind of a timetable, and it's very clear in terms of one task then another task, and they lay them out in a very intentional order and of what we need to do to get into recovery. And I think that it really understands this process of change. I mentioned in the beginning kind of surrender and willingness and acceptance and all that, those kind of first steps, the embracing seeing the need for some kind of power greater than us in there, and that idea of surrender, and so really making a foundation, but then getting into some of the inner work, that we could do in therapy, but we also do with steps with taking inventory and really sort of starting to dig deep and look at that and share it with another person, and then making a list of people that might have been harmed, and of course they're there, and I always remind my clients that who have the urge to kind of in their kind of pink cloud of early recovery, I'm going to go out and like make everything right with everybody in my life. Those steps, the immense steps, are not the first couple steps. They're not in the beginning at all. They're really embedded in the middle there in that process. So it guides us in what to do. It guides us in when to do it, and it ends up. I was talking about that purpose thing that's so important. I think the 10, 11, 12 especially are not just the maintenance steps we call them, but they're really about the service, about what we do with this gift of recovery and how it works, and by passing it on. And so I think it's an incredible, brilliant guide to this. And that's why I say, can it be done without a therapist? Yeah, of course. The steps are there. I just think therapy is helpful, but they certainly complement each other beautifully.
Yeah, and yeah, I just want to reiterate, the steps are in order for a reason. Steps 1, 2, and 3. I have a problem. I need help. I think I'll get some help. That's basically what those boil down to. And 4 is we start looking at ourselves, and then we share it. And then at 6 and 7, we start identifying and working on our character defects. And we do that before we start making amends to other people, because we need to be aware of our shortcomings so we don't carry them into the amends process. It's really a wonderfully designed program, and it really, there's a complete psychic change that happens if you diligently work the steps and get through to 10, 11, and 12. By the time I was at 10, 11, and 12, I looked back and thought, oh my God, who was that person?
Right.
I just couldn't understand how I had done all of the things that I had done. It's like, oh my God, was that really me? And I knew it was me. But can you also talk a little about the hero's journey? Because the Joseph Campbell hero's journey, I think mirrors the 12 steps very well, because it's a complete psychic change.
Right. Yeah. So we do a lecture for this, and there'll be a blog coming out on this shortly on our site, right? But a hero's journey is Joseph Campbell, who analyzed myths from many different cultures around the world, and found that a lot of the myths, certain stories have a whole cycle, an outline of the flow of the myth itself, that what he called the hero's journey, and it really mirrors the whole bottoming out and the recovery process in a really beautiful way. What he called the call to adventure, which is really this normal guy in the myth gets called into adventure, and that really gets called into this sort of exotic adventure. It could be a trip, and it could be a journey somehow. And in the addiction world, that really we're getting called into really dealing with ourselves. And as Joseph Campbell noted in the hero's journey, many people get called resist. And how many of us have had the car crash, or the arrests, or the divorce, or the threats, or the near misses? And these are all these calls to what Campbell called calls to adventure into this addictive process. And it goes on from there into this underworld with challenges and near-death experiences and near misses and help from mentors and strangers and guides. And it's this whole recovery journey that really echoes a lot of our own journey as we look back. And then at the end, this person that started out as a normal, everyday person emerges back into the world, much as we do when we have our recovery intact and we come back into the world. But what makes him our hero is that in these myths around the world, this person had been changed by the experience. So he'd been sometimes given immortal qualities, sometimes he gets the princess, sometimes he gets the castle, but he's this special person. And the most important thing is, what does he do with that? He uses that special experience he has to help other people, to help his people, to help strangers, to help people in need. And that, I just think it's such a beautiful parallel to the addictive cycle and the recovery cycle, as we kind of discover ourselves and become much, I guess, healthier and giving members of society, right? We're available, we're available to ourselves, and we're available to other people.
Yeah, and I think really the two most important parts of that, number one, there are mentors and guides, and we accept help. We learn from people who, know more than we do. And then by the end, we're giving it back. We're the mentor and the guide. We're giving back and making the world a better place. And, for me in recovery, that was the psychic change. I mean, that was the spiritual experience for me. I went from very, 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 very selfish and narcissistic, at least behaving, to somebody who actually is aware that other people exist and have thoughts and feelings. And, I might not want to trample them,
Right.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
I just wanted to point out a couple of things also, and we don't have a lot of questions yet, so I'm going to talk for a second. You talked about developing resilience. I call it obstacle immunity. That's kind of a motivational term for athletes, is obstacle immunity. Break through this barrier, and then and the theory is that once we get used to breaking through barriers or overcoming obstacles, it gets easier to overcome obstacles. Even bigger obstacles just don't really challenge us, or they at least don't challenge our thinking that way. And in recovery, life still happens. I mean, the engine light comes on in your car, or you get a flat tire, or your kid is sick, or whatever. And these things that we used to drink and act out over, we learn to handle them, usually with the help of other people. We call our sponsor and say, "Oh my God, I have a flat tire. What do I do?" And our sponsor says, "Call AAA," or flag somebody down and ask for help if you've never changed the tire, and we get through it, and with help from others. And then we learn that, we can just stop, breathe, figure out what to do, and then do it. But we often, and that's when we start giving back to others in need.
Yeah.
And I forget what the other point was. So let's go to our questions. I had another point there. So
It'll come back.
It'll come back, or it won't. Q&A here. Good evening, David. I met you briefly last night. By the way, David has a drop-in group that used to be on another website that is now on our site on Tuesday nights at
Same time, 8 Eastern, 5 Pacific.
8 Eastern, 5 Pacific. It's a drop-in group for substance sex addicts, yes?
It's called a chemsex support group, and it's basically anybody is welcome, but we focus on that fusion of different kind of drug behaviors and sex behaviors, and really provides a place to talk about that, which is very rare. It's hard to get that in a fellowship. It's hard to get that kind of support anywhere where people are struggling with that combined drugs and sex recovery. Tough stuff.
Yeah, highly recommended. And I have a group for single men on Friday night, and then I co-host with Garrett Irby every other week, the Monday 11 a.m. discussion group. So if you want more discussion and less talking heads, drop-in discussion groups are great. Assuming it's common that addictive behavior is driven to soothe an emotional wound, it seems that there would also be a common general path toward replacing that behavior with a better behavior. Learning to put a space between a thought and an action is essential, ?
Yeah, I think I totally agree that, addiction really is our way of handling wounds and emotional wounds and soothing that, and not by resolving them, but by numbing the pain or helping us step away from the pain into some kind of fantasy bubble, or step out of ourselves and kind of dissociate from that discomfort. And so that sort of ability to step out gets easier and easier. And so those things involve different behaviors, as you know. So I think having the ability, as you say, to put space between a thought and a behavior is essential, because one thing that most addicts don't have a good handle on is impulse control. And I think we can find ourselves taking action automatically. You know, one thing we're getting a better understanding about now is different kinds of triggers and cues and impulses, and how once those are deeply grooved or highly routinized. So as an addict, I will do the same, go from the same cue to the same behavior over and over and over again. And eventually I don't need to think about it. My brain knows how to do that automatically. And it does without even conscious choice. So if I am feeling emotional pain and I'm a sex addict and I've trained myself, that pain may translate immediately into feeling horny or feeling aroused or needing to kind of have a sexual urge, because I know that's how it's going to numb. So those things are so automated that it's really important to start to become conscious of the trigger and the following behavior. And that's where that gap, that impulse control, is really important to start to build. Now, we have a disadvantage with sex addiction and porn addiction and chemsex addiction, what I call the intensity addictions, because those triggers are so bright and hot and powerful that our brain is like super sensitized to jump there as soon as we have those impulses. And unfortunately, with addiction, the connection between our prefrontal cortex, which is the executive function of the brain, right? That's where the impulse control resides. That's kind of offline. So we're really at the mercy of our midbrainers saying, go, 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 and no braking system to kind of slow it down. So it's all the more important to develop a really conscious awareness of your own particular triggers and cues, so you can insert that space you're talking about and give yourself a chance to choose another behavior. Because right now in our addiction, we're going from impulse to behavior, and it's all automated. We don't have a choice in there. And so we really need to get those gaps where we can slow it down. I'll often work with my clients and ask them, okay, let's look at that trigger you just had and the resulting impulse to use or act out. And let's break it, let's take it, pretend like it's a video or a movie, and just slow it down to frame by frame, and really start to look at that ability to see, okay, here, you know, freeze frame, here's a place where you could do something different, right? And just really analyze it at that level to see where there's actually a choice. We're talking about embracing change. There's always a choice. And I think it's sometimes we don't see it, we don't see the opportunity, but to slow it down like that and say, okay, well, this is where I could choose this, because once I go down this path, I'm lost. You know, it's like once I hang out online on the apps, you know, just to see who's around, as many of my clients say they're doing on Scruff or Grindr or Tinder or whatever one it is, the longer we're there, the more dopamine our brain is getting, the more inevitable it becomes we're going to use. So I think really understanding those rituals, the triggers, and the thought patterns, and imposing some different routines on those is really important.
I also think, and David, correct me if I'm wrong, that this is one of the reasons that drop-in discussion groups and groups like this and 12-step meetings and work groups like we offer are so effective, is because we come in and people talk about being triggered in a setting where it's slowed down and it's safe and there's no chance of acting out or drinking. I've never seen anybody pop open a beer in an AA meeting. It just doesn't happen. We slow down, so we feel the triggers, we work through it, we learn what other people do to work through it, and it slows our process down. And we don't reward the trigger, by the way, by popping open the beer or opening up our phone and looking at porn or whatever it is that we do. I think it's really important, and this is, I guess, just replacing the action of actually opening the beer with, sitting in a room with people who don't want to open the beer and talking about it.
Right, and being able to have a safe enough place to do that. And I think that's why I believe treatment is so critical, because in those early days, it gives you a really safe, what a therapist calls a safe container, where kind of the staff and the peers that have been there longer kind of hold that space for people until they're able to do it themselves, right? Where they can talk about it. And I think it's so important because of all the kind of cognitive distortions I was referring to earlier, where our thoughts get really kind of muddled and we can kind of come to a conclusion that seems very logical to us because our thinking is all kind of twisted and contorted. So I can conclude, well, I do really need to have a beer. No, I don't, but I can't see that. And so having a group that can kind of gently and with empathy give me support, or maybe not, maybe I need a kick in the butt, but somehow it needs to be communicated to me that no, there's other ways to do it. You can do it this way and not that way, and to explore those safely. We can do the same thing in meetings, although I think in meetings they're less safe just because there's a wild card of people in there that we don't have control over. There's no facilitator like a therapist, it's all self-run, but still they provide ample opportunity to safely express and correct behaviors. And that's the thing we need to do. We can't just go out and do it. I think a lot of addicts, myself included, are kind of perfectionists and we're embarrassed to make mistakes. We have to go out and do everything perfectly. And when we're learning recovery skills, we're going to fall, we're going to trip, we're going to not do it elegantly, we're going to fumble. Not that we have to relapse, but it's going to be awkward. An example, when we learn to speak assertively, right? As many addicts don't know how to do, we're maybe passive aggressive, or we can't speak up for our own needs, or we don't have a voice to sometimes. So to learn how to not do it with hostility, but to speak assertively is awkward and to skill. And sometimes we come out too harsh, and sometimes we come out too timid, but it takes practice. I think all those recovery skills take practice to really make them work. So I think that process, that container is really essential for that. It's a long way of answering that, but I think it's important.
And the other thought I had about this, particularly with sex addicts, is we create circle plans. The inner circle is the stuff, bottom line behaviors. The middle circle is slippery. The outer circle is the healthy behaviors we can do instead of acting out. And I think it's so important to have that. And I do it. I work with people who aren't sex addicts as well sometimes, and I make them do circle plans, whatever their problem is, because I think it's so important to know, here's the stuff I don't want to do. Yeah, we all know what we're not supposed to do. What we don't often know is what we can do instead. And it took me 2 years of recovery to be able to fill my time without freaking out about relapsing.
Right.
And that was with a circle plan that I carried with me and would pull out and look at it and go, I can read a book, I can clean the house, I can shop.
And Scott, that's so important too. And I think it's something that the substance users don't often have access to or knowledge of, that idea. Because I think a lot of times, too often, meetings in recovery at first can just seem about just stop that behavior, control the behavior, just don't do it.
Yeah, and it's stop and do what with the 6 hours that I used to spend on
exactly, and do what. And I think it just, there's so much emphasis on just not acting out. Sometimes we forget that other part. And I think as a field, I'm happy to say, sex addiction, I think early on, it was more about containing the behavior and didn't know quite where to go from there. I think we're getting better at looking at intimacy and attachment and what is healthy sex and that kind of stuff. But yeah, that's been a problem that people just need some help recognizing sometimes. What do I do instead that's healthy? Oops, is that me? Are you? I can't tell. Uh-oh. Well, I'll continue, assuming it's Scott. He said he said his connection was bad tonight. Oh, there he is. You back? You're muted.
I'm back.
Okay, yeah, I figured I was gonna forge on, but now you're here.
Yeah, I am back. One of the things that should go in everybody's outer circle, I hope I'm not non sequituring, somebody popped the Avett Brothers some links into the chat feature. Huge fan of the Avett Brothers. They are clearly in recovery, and they sing just absolutely exquisite songs. The lyrics are heart-wrenching for people in recovery. I highly recommend the Avett Brothers.
Yeah.
So, okay, ready for the next question?
Yes.
Okay. I'm 1 month into D-Day. I've been seeing a therapist for the past 3 weeks via telehealth. She's not CSAT certified. I've never had therapy prior to this, but I found myself learning more on my own than from my therapist. Is this normal? I know finding a therapist is trial and error, but I'm having a hard time connecting with my therapist and have found myself omitting certain details because I feel like I'd be judged. I also feel like there is no structure to my sessions. She basically just listens to me talk. I'm not sure if it's really helping. Is this common? Yeah, go, David.
Yeah, so of course, this is common. It's not necessarily right, but I think I do hear this a lot. Let me just say, even the best therapist in the world is not a good fit or a perfect fit for everybody, right? So I think there's almost a necessity to see if there's chemistry between the two of you, to see if this person has the skill set, and also to see if this person has the style. Some therapists do just kind of sit there and reflect back and maybe very affirming and positive and maybe more neutral. But for somebody that may be needing more directed therapy or more guidance, it isn't necessarily a good stylistic match. Other people are very here and now, present tense, cognitive behavioral, meaning they just we talk about what's on the surface. We don't go into what's deeper, what's behind it, the reasons why you might be doing these things. We just want to control what you're doing. Other people, like myself, go a little deeper into maybe what's under this, what are the roots of this, let's look at maybe some of the trauma that may be underlying some of these behaviors, some of their life experiences. So I think there's just whole different styles. If you're dealing with somebody in this realm, if it's porn addiction or sex addiction, whether you're a partner, betrayed partner, or the addict, I think that CSAT credential is really important because this is a really specialized addiction and it has special outcomes in terms of both the impact on the partner and the levels of trauma that I think are just totally misunderstood by therapists that don't understand sex addiction. I think partners often are kind of minimized as maybe overly hysterical or controlling or whatever. It's people that just don't understand at all the nature of trauma and the ability to seek safety in those relationships and how upsetting it can be. So I think you need somebody that really understands the person. Also, CSATs, by just their training and orientation, I think are more willing to look at different kinds of aspects of really complex behaviors and give you more direct interactive feedback. But the bottom line, whatever the credentials, CSAT or not every therapist is a perfect fit for every client. And I think it's perfectly okay when you're trying out a therapist to go interview them, meet them, ask them about their style, ask them how they do things, and what you can expect. I think if you're sitting there feeling like you're going to be judged, that's a huge red flag to me, because I've had so many clients who have been harmed by even well-meaning therapists who were clueless and thought they could treat everything. And they ran into hearing about sexual behaviors or different kinds of things they didn't understand, or they just judged themselves. And I've had many clients end up being hurt by therapists before they find their way to me. So I think bottom line, I would trust your gut on this. And I would, it might be worth talking to this therapist about your concerns, what you're feeling, see what they say. But otherwise, I think at this, you've said enough really that it sounds like that relationship's not very helpful. And I think you could probably spend your money and time more wisely with somebody else. But it's a hard fit. It's like antidepressants. It sometimes takes a while before you find the right one. But I think if you have people, if you're in a group, a support group of other partners or addicts or whatever kinds of folks you identify with, and if they're in your town, or even these days, assume it doesn't even matter how close you are geographically. A lot of therapists are working online. Ask them who they work with, if they have somebody they like, and there's probably no better input on how you might do than hearing what other people think. I think that word of mouth is important.
Yeah, I just want to say, if you're going to a therapist and you're omitting certain details for any reason, you are not getting your money. You are not getting your money's worth. Number one, you're not getting the help you need. And if you're doing it because you feel like you should be judged, you are seeing the wrong therapist. Yeah, and I don't. If I get a cancer diagnosis, I don't go to the dentist. I go to the oncologist. If I'm a sex addict, I'm not going to, a psychoanalyst. I'm going to go to a CSAT who understands what I'm dealing with. Now, I have a guy in one of my work groups, which are all about psychoeducation, and I'll ask David to explain psychoed versus psychotherapy. And he is seeing a non-CSAT trauma therapist because he has trauma issues. And he's getting his sex addiction education through our online work group. And then he's coming to groups like this and 12-step meetings. He's doing a lot of stuff, but he's not seeing a CSAT, but he's getting his CSAT-ish needs met while he works on his trauma with a trauma therapist. But David, can you talk a little bit about the difference between psychotherapy and psychoeducation?
Right. So psychotherapy obviously is something facilitated by a trained psychotherapist, and that can be an individual, meeting with someone one-to-one. It can be in a group setting. Both are very well respected and very effective modalities. I think particularly a combination is even the most powerful. If I'm doing discharge planning for a client and I can get them set up with an individual therapist and get them also into a group, a facilitated group run by a therapist, that's ideal. So groups are powerful. It's our main modality here at Seeking Integrity, but it's also a really main modality for aftercare. So psychoeducation.
David, you got it.
Yeah, so psychoeducation is really not so much about the therapeutic process, it's more teaching and class. Psychoeducation is more about information and learning without some of the deeper kind of structures that look at the dynamics of what's going on kind of under the surface. And so I think our groups, like Scott mentioned, we have a bunch of different work groups that are psychoeducational, meaning we don't do therapy online, but we do these 6-week programs that have a lot of content and are really helpful. In any given day at Seeking Integrity, we have individual groups, we have group therapy, we have individual therapy, and we have psychoeducation groups. We have it all because all of them are really considered an important necessity for the therapeutic day. I might mention that there's 12-step groups, of course, and 12-step groups are none of the above. 12-step groups aren't psychoeducation, 12-step groups aren't psychotherapy. They're support groups. They're mutual support groups that are peer-led and extremely important as part of this constellation of things we do. But I think a lot of clients sometimes initially at least misinterpret that their 12-step group is the equivalent of going to therapy, and it's just not. They're two very different things.
Not at all. One of the jokes in 12-step meetings is the difference between therapy and 12 steps is we don't care how you feel. we care if you're acting out or not. Let us help you with that. You take your feelings to your therapist, and that's not entirely true, but I mean, it's a big difference between therapy and 12 steps.
That's funny. Yeah.
And psychoed is learning about the addiction. We teach people what a circle plan is, and we walk them through the process of creating one. That's psychoeducation, as opposed to psychotherapy. We hear this question too. I go to my individual therapist and he or she is great, and I tell them everything. Why does my therapist also want me to go to group therapy?
Right. Well, the benefit of group, and really, I think they both have a place. But individual therapy, if I'm doing that with a therapist, with a client, I do trauma work, but I can do other kinds of interactive work that helps them see patterns. I get to know that person, they get to know me, and we kind of talk about stuff. I can see things that maybe they may not see in terms of their own lives and patterns and causes and decisions they're doing. It's kind of, we work individually. The group also covers some of that same terrain about why am I doing what I'm doing? What's in my background? What am I avoiding? But instead of working with a therapist who has that kind of authoritarian stance, I guess, you're in a group with therapists, but you're also, the power of a group is with the other peers, the other members of the group. And I can't tell you how often I've seen A therapist says something, it's like, yeah, okay. But a peer says the same thing, and it just carries so much more weight because it's more relatable. It's like, this is another person just like me, and he's saying this, and I can identify with that. And so there's a power that comes with peers kind of saying, calling it like it is, that really is powerful. And I've seen just change. It's like an accelerant for change. We're talking about change tonight, embracing change. I think that ability to get into a group just speeds everything up in terms of the healing. It's a really powerful modality.
Yeah, and it helps break through denial for sure. If I hear somebody else justifying their actions and I think, oh, that's crazy, and then I realize that I've used the same justification, I'm like, oh, I do that too. So we get to call each other out. And the other thing I think group helps with is shame.
Oh,
Because
God, yeah.
particularly sex addicts, we walk in with so much shame. So to talk to people who are nodding their heads and not like freaking out as, you know, we say what's going on in our head or what we did yesterday, or, you know, it helps us not get mired in shame, which keeps us stuck in our addiction. And it gives us the impetus to actually have a better life. And there's just something, you know, my home group here in Palm Springs, at the end of the meeting, we do the we version of the serenity prayer. You know, God grant us the serenity to accept the things that we cannot change, the courage to change the things we can, and the wisdom to know the difference, because it's all about, we just can't do it on our own. And a therapist is great, but we need more.
Right. I just want to really emphasize that piece about shame reduction too, because shame just underlies every addiction. But as Scott said, especially sex and porn addiction, it's just such a hallmark of it. And so I think to in every single client we have at Seeking Clarity comes in, they all have, you know, stuff I'm going to carry to my grave. Nobody's ever going to hear about this. They're so embarrassed, so mortified by it. Things we do, and that are just so abhorrent to the kind of people we want to be sometimes, the things we've done through our addiction. And so when they do say those things, and every morning, by the way, when we go around and check in, we ask people to reveal if they had any lies or secrets in the past 24 hours. And if they haven't, to share a secret from the past. And why do we do that? Just to help shame reduction, start getting it out in the air. And sometimes people will reveal stuff with great trepidation and shame and even tears sometimes at how they're going to be perceived. And the beautiful thing about a group, the beautiful thing about a 12-step meeting is when you, at least every time I've ever done, and I'm sober 40-some years, people reveal stuff, they release it, they say, this is what I've done. And the group sits there and go, yeah. And many times they say, well, I did that too. Or, you know, but it's, Brene Brown talks about how shame kind of withers in sunlight. And I think when we express this stuff, get it out in the group and see that, and it's not to say it wasn't a bad thing or a horrible thing, but it's what we're doing to ourselves, carrying this knowledge that we've done it ourselves. And by having it be received without judgment and accusation in our face is an incredibly healing experience, really healing.
Yeah, thank you. We've got two more questions. They're from different people, but I'm going to read them together because I think they are very related here. So the first one is it necessary to do years of deep therapy and trauma work for complete recovery and a happy life? And then the other one is, can you talk a bit about the line connecting the type of early trauma to the way the addict inevitably acts out? How are they related? Is there much research on this? So both kind of looking at early life trauma, what it does to us and what we can do about it and how much work we need to do to overcome.
And I'm glancing at the clock. Okay.
Yeah, we have 8 minutes, go.
So yeah, the first part, you know, I think it can be overwhelming. And we started out tonight talking about embracing change and how there's a lot of work. You know, when somebody gets newly sober, we're confronted with a lot of wreckage and it's what seems like insurmountable tasks to get through. And I think it seems like it's going to take forever. The same thing, I think, sometimes feels that way with trauma work and some of the therapy recovery work that we have to do. I will say trauma work generally doesn't have to be long term. It's not the psychoanalysis where you kind of just talk and hope that you get connections. Trauma work is very guided, and it's often considered short-term therapy for some people. But the important thing about trauma work is that it has to be not just a talk therapy component, it has to have what we call somatic component, because we know trauma lives in the body as well. Trauma is stored in the body. And so if you don't have a modality that recognizes how to release it from your body or recognize the body's signs, you're not going to get too far. And so most good trauma modalities do have a somatic component, and I think they can be quite efficient. I will say, as my little spiel, that you don't want to get into trauma work too soon in recovery, because our addictions are our primary coping mechanisms, how we handle or not handle feelings. And without them in early recovery, we're kind of raw. We don't have, until we build new skills to deal with feelings, to regulate our emotions, to not about jumping to conclusions and kind of handling impulse control, all that stuff. Till we get that in shape, I would be reluctant to start trauma therapy with a client until they have those resources that I know because by definition, doing trauma work, and it's not re-experiencing all the agony, but you do feel painful emotions. There's sadness, there's fear, there's other things that come up in a very controlled and safe way, but you do
and
feel
a lot of
them.
times new memories come up too, which can be
Right.
really triggering.
Right. And that can be also very triggering. So you want to make sure somebody's stable before you do that. But then once it starts, trauma work can go relatively efficiently. And so it's not a lifelong project at all. In my own life, I have gone through periods where I am in therapy, and then I'll stop therapy for 5 years, 6 years, and I go back to therapy for a year or two, and then I stop again, and just kind of depending on where I'm at in my own life. But the most critical work I did was early on with the initial trauma work that I had. So trauma work is beautifully important. Just the timing is everything. Now, why even do trauma work? What's the relationship here? Well, we know that when kids largely experience what we call adverse childhood experiences, and that can be all kinds of abuse, whether it's physical, sexual, emotional, spiritual. It can be having a parents who are an alcoholic. It can be parents who got divorced. It can be a sibling who has a chronic illness. Anything that makes that home unusual. And the one that people don't always miss is neglect. Neglect defined as a lack of what we call parental attunement, meaning my parents. Parental attunement means that my parents are connected to me. They tell me they love me. They're in tune with my emotions. If I get silent for a couple of days, they're going to ask, why are you talking? What's going on? They take an interest in my feelings and my inner life. A lot of people don't have that. And so when they're going back, when they come in, my childhood was great. But when we look back, it's like they're looking for something traumatic that they can't see because it didn't happen. What didn't happen is that parental attunement. So the role of neglect is really critical. So all those things from early on, it's quite physiological. They affect our brain development. If a child is traumatized, their brain actually develops in a very different way. Physically, it's different. There's different amounts of gray matter and white matter. And the brain is so marvelous, it can kind of do workarounds and compensate. But what it can't compensate for, if there's that damage from childhood trauma, is this need for, it's misreading social cues. It's kind of some ADHD symptoms. It's the need for kind of high-risk behavior. It's a little bit of acting out. It kind of sets these kids off on a trajectory that starts getting into trouble behaviorally, trying drugs, getting into sex too soon, looking at porn, getting in trouble. And that just sets the stage for this whole thing playing out with greatly higher risks of depression, injection drug use, suicide, even shorter lifespans. So all these things are not, I always say they're not destiny, but it's really important for you to know that these things can impact you and take that to a therapist who can work with you to mitigate the consequences of that. But the single biggest consequence is addiction. Because what do we do when we don't have really adult coping skills to handle handle life? We check out or we escape into our addictive behavior. So there's a direct link between trauma and addiction.
And there's a link also between the type of trauma and the type of addiction, although not as definite, but people who have sexual trauma in childhood are much more likely to become sex addicts than people who did not have sexual trauma. And there's
Right.
100 different kinds of sexual trauma too. It's not just overt sexual contact. It's also covert, what we call covert incest or enmeshment, where you're
Right.
partnerized by a parent. Covert incest was when you're partnerized with a sexualized element, but no actual contact. Overt incest is when you're touched, or overt sexual abuse is when you're touched. And then there's sexual neglect, where you're not taught anything about sex. There are no role models for you. All of
And
that
also,
sexual
we
shame.
we talk about attachment wounds too, right? Where if I'm a kid and my parents are not ever there for me, what are the takeaways? I take it, well, I'm on my own. I can't count on anybody to meet my needs, so I better meet them myself, right? And that's the setup for a porn addict right there, a sex addict. But we learn that we can't trust anybody. So how can I be vulnerable? How can I ever get into an intimate relationship if early on I learned that I can't ever trust anybody because I'm only going to get hurt? So these things all play out in all those ways. And to what Scott was just saying, a lot of the sexual abuse ends up in what we call sensation seeking. So and it sounds counterintuitive, but people need the sensation to kind of distract themselves from the emotions they don't want to feel. And so you may get kids who are bungee jumping or parachuting or seeking a sensation in that way. And it can lead to other kinds of sensation too, which is chemsex, porn, sex addiction, gambling, even work sometimes.
Yeah. Thank you, David. Thank you, everybody. Great topic as always. Great discussion. Great questions as always.
Yeah.
We will be back next week, same time, same channel. Anything you want to say to take us out, David?
Just, we started out talking about change, and change is something we need to learn to not only accept but embrace, because it's all we got. So there's a lot of help to do it too.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you,
See you next
Scott.
week.
Good night.